Hello and welcome to Rotary Times, a public service program presented by the Rotary District of 7610. Funding for this program has been made possible by the generosity of Rotary District 7610, Virginia. On our program, we speak with Rotarians and community leaders to learn and discuss how Rotary International builds partnerships to support local, national, and world communities. I am your host, District Governor Pat Borowski from the Rotary Club of Bailey's Crossroads, Virginia. Last year, across the globe, children and families of Afghan refugees displaced by war in their country fled to the United States and our region of the Commonwealth. Rotary District 7610 mobilized to embrace and deliver support to the people affected by this humanitarian crisis. This prompted a new district initiative aimed at helping Afghan refugees as they resettled into their new lives and the Northern Virginia region. Joining me today remotely is Rotarian Sonia Patterson from the Rotary Club of Vienna, Virginia, as the coordinator for our district's Afghan Refugee Initiative. She will share highlights of this initiative under the leadership of our district. And welcome, Sonia. It's really terrific to have you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Well, as we do with every single program, first of all, give us some of your background and your journey to Rotary.
Yes, of course. Well, my father was a lifelong Rotarian. And yes, so I'm following in his footsteps of joining Rotary. My first Rotary Club was back in 1998 in San Juan, Puerto Rico. I was there, a member there for 3 years. And then after moving back to the DC area, I joined up with the Vienna, Virginia Rotary Club back in 2012. So my Rotary journey has spanned the decades, as they say.
And additionally, what attracted you to Rotary, and give us some of your professional background?
Sure. Well, I was attracted to Rotary certainly because of its motto, service above self. It's something that I deeply believe in and have spent my life living and serving, living for and serving others in humanitarian international relief and development. My background includes an MBA from the Thunderbird School focused on entrepreneurship in Latin America. In addition to that, I've managed as a CEO 2 international organizations, and now I'm running my own philanthropy consulting business in Northern Virginia, bringing together all kinds of houses of worship and civil society members to come together in partnership to serve the community's needs.
Well, Sonia, I want to say thank you very much for choosing Rotary. We were very fortunate to have you in our district. And thank you so much for stepping up and taking on the leadership in our, what started out first as a small group trying to decide how should we respond. Tell us a little bit about how you helped form that group and kind of the progression that we have going on now.
Sure, absolutely. Well, as of the fall of Kabul back in the middle of August of 2021, we had refugees arriving at Dulles Airport and a lot of people saying they wanted to help, but nobody knowing exactly how to help. And due to your leadership, Pat, we were able to pull that group together and start brainstorming ways that we could get Rotary clubs to support existing efforts to help with the basic needs of the refugees. At the time when the refugees were arriving at the Dulles Expo Center, they were being processed and then sent out to what they call safe haven military bases around the United States. So as our response grew and changed over the next few months, we were able as Rotary clubs to really step into the gap and help the entire way along the process.
Right, and you brought up a couple of important points I think that all our clubs and listeners should appreciate. This was a different type of immigration in and response to a human crisis, because while there was some processing that was done at the U.S. bases in Afghanistan, a lot of that really wasn't able to take place in as full a context as the U.S. government is used to. So that was why they needed to come in and process. And could you share with our audience just under what classification, if you will, did the Afghani refugees come in under?
Sure. Well, the Afghan refugees had, it depended on the group. So we did have some that were working directly with U.S. government allies over in Afghanistan, and they had already gone through the paperwork of securing their special immigrant visa, SIV. So we still had some of those coming in, but the vast majority of the folks that came in that big wave of refugees back in August and September and October were here underneath humanitarian parole. And humanitarian parole is a very temporary status. It's not even temporary protected status, which is what we have now. Right. But there are all kinds of designations that the Department of State has regarding the asylum seeking process and whether or not folks qualify as a refugee. So you're absolutely right. There was a lot of confusion and certainly based on the process that we went through to get those the Afghans out of Afghanistan. The vast majority came here underneath the humanitarian parole program.
Correct. And I'll tell you, in the very beginning of this, the information that was coming into me from my contacts at State Department in the military bases that were coordinating this was way more than I could have ever possibly dealt with as a district governor. And it was great to identify you and about 5 people in our district who were really right there at the point's end of this process, already being pulled in by state or Red Cross or someone to really help the rest of our clubs understand that. And talk a little bit about having to get organized for this. And let me give you an example. I would get calls from clubs and they're like, oh yeah, we're collecting books, we're collecting clothes, I'm like, please stop collecting. We're not at that stage yet. So if you would take it from there, how the initial group of you, I think were the only non-Afghan in that 5-person group we had.
Yes, that's correct. And one of the things that we needed to do in our group was to make sure that we were connecting with the Afghan American diaspora in our area, because we certainly didn't want to repeat a lot of the efforts that group was leading. And so the folks that came together were really sharing information. Someone was saying, well, we're on point for clothes for children, and others were focused on women's needs and what have you. And so we were able to sort of divide and conquer and to say to one another, okay, what are the gaps and how can we communicate to the clubs what is needed? And so as we went through the process of even understanding the role of the resettlement agencies at the time,
correct.
If you remember back then, when we had the refugees on the bases, they were slowly going out to resettlement agencies across the country. And even leading up to the holiday season, the vast majority of Afghan refugees were still on bases. And so we had to mobilize Rotary clubs to support the needs on the bases, as well as supporting the refugees that were showing up in our communities.
Yeah, and those were very different needs. And I think the other thing that was so extraordinarily important, and it really was important to us as a group, and to really convey to our clubs, and that is to respond with cultural sensitivity and application. A good example was just directing people on the nature of clothing that you might be purchasing for the refugees, talking about what kinds of kitchenware would be appropriate so that they'd feel comfortable and competent to be able to make those dinners, and talk a little bit about that communication process.
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. We needed to be very sensitive to not only to the specific cultural needs that the Afghan refugees were experiencing, but also the fact that they had just experienced trauma.
Right.
And a lot of the children that came here really needed creative outlets to be able to express themselves given the trauma that they had experienced. And one of the ways that we did that was that we reached out to our Afghan American diaspora, and we focused on a long list of translators that could speak Dari or Pashto. And we got them involved in the efforts in making sure that we were communicating the right thing in the right way. Right. At the right time based on the language. That was an important factor as well. And we also made a list of all the local grocery stores that would carry the kind of food that they were interested in. And we also partnered with some local Afghan restaurants that they would be supplying some food as well. So we really reached out, and it's a tremendous network in Northern Virginia to begin with, but we had tentacles all over the place.
Well, and additionally, talk a little bit about the Vienna Club. What was it in the Vienna Club that they so readily said, yeah, let's go with this, let's do it?
Our Vienna Club is such an amazing club because they are so interested in helping to the largest extent you can imagine. They run the Viva Vienna Festival. Right. That festival results in supporting dozens and dozens of charities, both within the United States as well as internationally. So not only do we have international representation within our club, but we also have lots of experience of folks that have lived overseas, worked overseas, speak different languages, have even worked and lived in that part of the world. And so it was a natural step up for the Vienna Club to get involved. And it wasn't even a second thought. It wasn't a discussion. It's like, we're going to do this, and then we just move forward. And frankly, I'm the foundation chair for our club, and I saw a need, and I stepped up, and I talked to our club leadership and our board. Every single person was so supportive. There wasn't one person that said, "Oh, I don't know if we should do this or not." Our club was tremendously supportive.
Well, Sonia, that is so true about Rotary clubs, and definitely reflect the attitude of the other 4 clubs that joined with you on the initial effort. We will take a short break and be right back and speak more with Rotarian Sonia Patterson. Please stay with us.
We've been here before, fighting the problems that fight back, because we see opportunities where others see obstacles. We're change makers and problem solvers, uniting over 1 million minds to address complex issues facing communities around the world, including yours. We're working together as partners and professionals, while making friendships that last a lifetime. We're Rotary, and there's no limit to what we can do.
Welcome back to the Rotary Times. We are here speaking with Rotarian Sonia Patterson about Rotary's District 7610's Afghani Refugee Initiative. So Sonia, we were just going to start going into what kind of response and the nature and items of response that we started to see come through.
Yes, absolutely. Certainly when folks first started arriving into the U.S., most of them just had the change of clothes that they were wearing, and that was it. So we mobilized a tremendous, we helped in the process of mobilizing clothes. But the natural reaction is going to be things like shirts and pants and sweaters and maybe some baby clothes and things like that. But nobody had considered the need for undergarments, for underwear. And as the refugees were processed through the system, and we had roughly 8,000 refugees down at Fort Pickett in Virginia, which was really the closest and most substantive military safe haven base close to our area, we realized that there was a tremendous need for underwear. So we organized something called Undie Sunday. And Undie Sunday was where we got Rotary clubs to pick 2 Sundays, I think it was in the month of October, and just have folks bring underwear to church. And we ended up collecting thousands and thousands of pairs of underwear, brand new, men's, women's, children's, all sizes. And we ended up getting it straight down to Fort Pickett that next week after we had finalized the collection efforts. So it was timely, it was needed, and it really made the difference because it was one of those supplies that other folks were just not thinking about.
Right. And then the other issue too is there was a coat drive that was necessary, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Certainly with the colder weather that was starting up, we could tell in September and October that this was going to be a problem. And the Rotary Network went to bat for coats. They went and collected, again, hundreds and hundreds of coats. We were put in touch with others who had coat drives for other charities and what have you, and we ended up getting a lot of coats donated for the Afghan refugees.
Yeah, I can tell you our bank was involved in that as well, so
Yeah.
we directed them to that. Now, Virginia really was, or Dulles incoming, was really the #1 area for at least the initial U.S. destination for these refugees. So, #1, why was that? And can you give us a little picture of exactly how that process worked? Because it was a bit more complex than we're used to.
Yes, absolutely. Certainly when it all first started, all of the refugees were being flown into Dulles Airport. So all the refugees, we were getting 5,000 to 10,000 showing up each week, and they were all taken to the Dulles Expo Center and then processed and sent in buses off to safe haven military bases. Because it was an ongoing effort, refugees then started arriving in other cities in the United States, like Philadelphia and Chicago. But we still got a fair number of refugees in Northern Virginia. Once they were sent off to the safe haven military bases in Virginia, we had Fort Lee, we had Quantico, and we had Fort Pickett. And from there, we found out through other networks that refugees that were sent to Texas and New Mexico wanted to come to Northern Virginia. Northern Virginia having a large Afghan American diaspora.
Yes.
So Northern Virginia is actually the #1 state, this part of our state, for resettling refugees in all of the United States.
Right.
And that is because of our existing Afghan American diaspora.
Right, and I don't think most people really appreciate, in addition to that, just overall what a large Islamic community that we have in Northern Virginia. I believe it's the largest actually in the United States. So yes, they had a lot of relatives here. They already had some connections in addition to just wanting to be with the diaspora to help them.
Absolutely. And Dar al-Noor, the Adams Center, and many other Muslim organizations were a part of the response. It was in partnership with them that we were able to have the impact that we had.
Right, absolutely. Now, we also talked about phases with this, and when they all came in and they were at the Dulles Center, they also were being processed, a number of them, through the Inova health system so that they were getting health care. And then, but I think you need to talk about, really we're talking about a long-term welcome here, are we not?
We are, absolutely. Yeah, we refer to it as the long welcome because as you said, this is a very unusual circumstance, what happened with Afghanistan. The U.S. has accepted refugees before, but nothing like this before. It's been tremendously challenging because even our resettlement agencies didn't have the staff and the budget to really absorb these numbers. But in any case, you're absolutely right. Not only was the Inova health system stepping up, we also had a number of refugees go to Bethesda. And in Bethesda, they were getting special medical care there. We had a tremendous outreach effort going on in partnership with other organizations working to support them. So you're right. It was multifaceted and somewhat complicated by the idea that, as more refugees were arriving in the United States, they were going to bases and then also being sent to resettle in our area. So all of these things were happening at the same time.
Right. So it was a lot of moving parts. And what was true in the morning probably was changed and in some other phase in the afternoon or the evening. So it was quite trying to keep all the pieces in play and direct clubs as to how they can get involved. And that's a point that you raised also, the different segments of clubs that we had involved. And if you could talk a little bit about how that was organized as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We had some clubs that were very familiar and had relationships already established with groups that were working with the Afghan American diaspora, as you mentioned. We also had clubs that wanted to help that literally didn't know where to start. They didn't know what to do. They weren't even sure how to approach this in the first place.
Correct.
I mean, it was because, unfortunately in our country, it's an attention span issue where one thing pops up after another. And in this case, with this being a need, even to today, it's still a need. It's an ongoing need.
Right.
We have to continue to find ways to creatively put this in front of clubs. But in order for clubs to understand how they can engage, they do have to go through a process of discernment. As we know in our district, we have a lot of clubs and they're super active in supporting lots of different charities. And so what we didn't want to have is a scarcity mindset where the pie was only so big and there was a certain slice for whatever group was decided. Instead, we approached this with an abundance mindset.
Right.
And that mindset really said, whatever's needed, we're going to step up and we're going to do it. And how we can pull the clubs together and pull out and sort of step around what needs to happen and come alongside our nonprofit partners that are already working in Northern Virginia area and other parts of Virginia to help the refugees.
Right, and this idea of constantly being able to meet the needs of the people as they are in whatever stage they are. And
Yes.
I think that's something that has been very important to communicate to clubs, because we're usually, okay, they need this, give them that, and not realizing that it's kind of a rolling level of needs. Like you were talking about the underwear, we had the diaper program. People don't think of that either. And so the other thing I wanted to talk about was about the refugees that are now, you're talking about different stages. Now we have refugees coming into the Loudoun Center. Now, how are the Loudoun community people, are they the same as we saw coming into Dulles Airport, or are they at a different stage of their relocation process? And how did you reach out to the clubs there?
Sure. So yes, we're in phase 2 of the process, according to the State Department, and this is Operation Allies Welcome, which is welcoming our Afghan neighbors into the U.S. And at the National Conference Center, there are going to be about 1,000 refugees at any given point arriving there and then being processed and sent out to other resettlement agencies around the U.S. So yes, they were in different stages, the folks that are showing up at the National Conference Center, because what happened in their case was that they were able to get out of Afghanistan one way, shape, or form, not back in August, but subsequently.
Right.
But they ended up in a different country, like a country like Albania or other countries. And so then they get processed through the State Department and other safe haven bases in those other countries, and then flown into the US as a part of the process. So that's where you see those numbers changing. And you're right, they are in a different phase. Because previously we were sending the refugees that came into the U.S. to safe haven military bases in the United States. That's not happening anymore. Okay. The refugees that are coming into the U.S. are all going to the National Conference Center, and then from there, they're being sent out to the resettlement agencies.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, first of all, our clubs need to be taking notes, and definitely you're the person they should contact to understand what they should do, how they should do it, when they should do it. But this also raises a good example. Who would have thought back in the beginning of this process with the emergency Afghani humanitarian crisis that we would be facing a second one for our Ukraine brothers and sisters. And this, I think, is a good example because explain how we're now beginning to process some of the Ukrainian people into the United States and some of their process at this point.
Sure, absolutely. As you said, it is a bit of a different situation in that with the war in Ukraine, the vast majority of the refugees that we've seen from that conflict are in neighboring countries like Poland and Romania. However, Biden had just let us know, I believe it was last week,
Yes.
that 100,000 were going to be welcomed into the United States.
Right.
Well, that's going to be over a process of time. And
Yes.
so what they've done is they've prioritized certain groups of individuals, whether or not they have family contacts in the United States, whether or not they worked with the US government in Ukraine, whether or not they are a journalist who was persecuted, or, there are all these different criteria
Right.
that they use for asylum seekers and refugees. And so they'll be going through a process of determining how they will move those Ukrainians into the US. The vast majority, though, are sticking as close to Ukraine
Yes.
as possible, hoping, of course, that this conflict is over
Absolutely.
sooner rather than later.
Right. Well, Sonia, thank you so much for sharing this information and being a guide for our clubs. We really appreciate it and thank you. Funding for this program is made possible by the generosity of Rotary District 7610, Virginia. For the Rotary Times program, I am your host, District Governor Pat Borowski from the Rotary Club of Bailey's Crossroads, Virginia. You are welcome to join us at Rotary clubs in our area and in your locations for breakfast, lunch, dinner, or service project. You can find a club near you by looking us up on the internet. Many clubs are hosting in-person, virtual, and hybrid meetings, so just look us up for the details. Remember, our time is your time, and together it is time well spent. Please join us for our next program as we continue to celebrate Rotary's 117 years of service above self.